welcome Aimee View. She is going to talk on play and practice and creativity using improv principles and design thinking. Aimee is a senior consultant at Fathom Consulting, and her secret weapon is empathy. Consulting brings you into contact with a range of people, she says, and as long as we're in this specific relationship, we may as well have fun. She's worked with nonprofits and Fortune 500 companies to solve problems through human-centered facilitation, research, and design. Not your typical consultant, Aimee's curiosity about people and everything else has led her to roles in community impact, policy, and startups, where she's had opportunities to nudge the world towards what it should be. Please welcome Aimee View.
Hi, everyone. All right, I'm gonna pull up. There we go. Hi, everyone. So I'm super excited to share my talk with you, play and practice in creativity using improv principles and design thinking. So a little bit about me. I am a senior consultant at Fathom, and I came into consulting in a relatively non-traditional way. I've spent time in politics, startups, philanthropy, and actually my time in philanthropy is where I did a lot of my consulting work with foundations, running strategy and design thinking workshops to really ideate on how to move millions to fund social impact work. I loved it and I loved consulting. And so then fast forward to 2023, that's when I joined Fathom. And so a little bit about Fathom, we're based in the North Loop neighborhood in Minneapolis, where we work on a lot of human-centered design, facilitation, and research. It was kind of a perfect fit for me when I was looking for where to do consulting. We get to do a bunch of projects in healthcare, med tech, but also get to work in consumer products and services and also B2B2C work. This will be our 25th anniversary, and it's super exciting. And so in my work, I am a practitioner in design thinking, facilitation, and research. And earlier this year, I attended a talk by Foma Ike. She's the author of Equity Mindset, where she described what it meant to call yourself a practitioner, that it is to critique, evolve, understand, and develop whatever you're working on. So I've adopted that language as well and calling myself a practitioner in all these things. But I want to give you a little background about my experience that led up to my design thinking and facilitation work. This is me as a kid. I'm probably 7 years old here. And as I look at this photo, my expression is just about as on par with all the other kids' emotions around me, except maybe the kid behind me. They actually look excited to be there. I'm a child of 2 refugee immigrants, and my parents wanted to put their kids in everything and anything that they could. Extracurriculars were always important. And so my mom put me in a community play of Snow White and the 7 Dwarves. I got to be dwarf number 4, but not dwarf number 4 as in sleepy. Those were cast by real kid actors for my community play. I was dwarf number 4 as in dwarf number 4 in the choir, but I still got to be part of rehearsals and theater week and kind of all the theater things leading up to opening night. I had one line in the one scene that I was in where the dwarves were getting ready for a meal after having done some laundry outside, and I was to look for a signal from Snow White as she was carrying her basket of folded laundry to say, "Let's eat." And so on opening night, I remember Snow White smiling at me, and she gave me a nod, which was the signal, and waited for a really long time. And in showbiz, the show must go on. So she said my line, "Let's eat." And I forgot my one line. And so I always wanted to be a theater kid, but that first play experience made me really nervous about forgetting my lines. And so as I grew up, I channeled all of that energy into public speaking, storytelling, and just like a bunch of other creative outlets that wasn't theater. But actually, a few years ago, I felt that itch again of my 7-year-old self. So I started to take improv classes to A, finally live my dream as a theater kid, and B, just to have a fun play space as an adult. And this is just a fun photo of my improv class. And so, a quick overview: improv's a form of live theater where everything in the performance is made up on the spot. There's short form, long form, and narrative. And I love long form improv because it gives a longer, wider structure to play in. And in long form, you get to start, you kind of start with nothing. You don't really know where it's going, but you're trying to create a show. Scenes are created on the spot, and characters are built as you go. And the myth about improv is that it's always funny, but it's actually not always tied to comedy. And so you've probably seen some improv things already. Think of the work of like Kristen Wiig, Tina Fey, Amy Poehler. They've all had improv as part of their career, and also their acting career. But, long form lets you build, create, and shape an idea into multiple scenes, multiple characters, and you get to build as you go. You can't really come in with preconceived notions of what's going to happen, and you have to trust the process. And, this is also how design thinking feels, right? You have to trust the process. I'm sure you've heard that or said that yourself. And so I found my practice in improv and the things I was learning in that play space starting to really support and inform my design thinking and facilitation practice as well. And there are four things or sayings that have stuck with me that I'll talk about today. So the first one is, you are never too cool for anyone. Play it real and lean into empathy. Ideate to the best idea, and then be flexible and pivot. And so in improv, you never know what's going to come up in a scene based off of a prompt. And, in improv, we're really trying to play with each other in the scene. And I can hear my improv coach saying to me, like, you're never too cool for anyone or any character. Because as a team, we're really building a world together where we believe anything everyone is saying. And it forces me to constantly say yes and affirm the reality that my scene partner is saying to me in the scene that we're doing. So, in one of our practices, we were given the prompt of teacher. We were two teachers chilling in the break room, and we were really trying to channel our best Abbott elementary energy, but it actually kind of fell flat. And our coach stopped us mid scene. He asked us, how would you really feel in that situation? Being a teacher on your one break, which actually made me think of my mom being a teacher and hearing her anecdotes growing up. So I switched to play this like fed up, retiring teacher trying to pass off coordinating the school play to the newbie teacher. And it actually totally added some depth and humanness to our performance. Similarly, in design thinking, we're talking to people all the time in the discovery phase, and sometimes we don't know who or how they're going to show up that day. I've been doing discovery interviews with hospital clinicians all across the world for a project, and it's been a firsthand experience in learning cultural differences. And I love talking to people, but what I've learned is, on the flip side, I've also learned how to be a really good listener. I recently spoke to a Scandinavian clinician, and their insights were really apt. And as the clinician would be talking, I'd add in small affirmation, something like, "Yes, what you're experiencing, I'm also hearing across the world." Just validating them in their experience, or relating my own experience to something else that they said. And at the end, when I asked if there was anything else they wanted to add, they said to me, "Talking with you is really nice. I thought, how can I spend 30 or 45 minutes, but you're such a nice person and have very nice questions. I was afraid I couldn't manage because my English is not that good." And I felt for them in that moment. And so I'm glad that the clinician's anxiety subsided by the end of the call. It was one of those moments where affirming their experience really went a long way, and I think it felt really good for the both of us. And so in improv or design thinking, everyone brings their experience into the process, and you're never too cool for anyone to take the time to be present because at the end of the day, we're here to collaborate and invite people into the process that we're doing. And so empathy is at the core of building characters in improv. There's a level of observation required when beginning a scene. Who's going to say the first line and set the tone, or do the first action and set the scene? We're creating on the spot, but in the first few seconds, you really need to set the who, what, where, when, and why. And we have to play real characters in improv who have real needs and wants and desires that make them real. So I realized that I tend to play characters that are either super chill or super emotional. There's no in between. And in a scene I was doing, I was playing a bride at the altar with my groom and officiant. And I began saying my vows in a different tone, but was stopped by my coach. He was like, "You're not a believable character." And so I had to tap into myself and ask, how would I feel if I were saying vows, right? Like saying your vows at the altar is an emotional moment. So I started to cry as I was giving my vows in this scene. And it was a significantly more successful scene where the groom and the officiant began to cry with me. And that was probably one of the most fun scenes I got to do because we all just cried together. And so when beginning any design thinking process, we have to really understand our users, right? Everyone has real needs and wants, and those needs need to be included in the process. And I worked on a project where I got to do in-home research with patients with diabetes and followed it up with a design thinking workshop with the client. Um, One woman stood out to me, Donna, and I sat down at her dining table, and in the chair next to me, her Maine Coon joins us. And before diving into our diabetes conversation, we talked about our cats, and I showed her a picture of my cat. And then I noticed that she was even wearing a cat shirt. I could feel her opening up to me a little bit more in that moment. And fast forward to the workshop, I ran a room with a room full of engineers. They are mostly mid 30s to 40s, lean, white males. And I was thinking of ways to build empathy, and I knew I could count on my conversation with Donna. So I had them read quotes from Donna and had pulled a picture of her in this exact cat shirt. And one of the quotes that I had them read were about her arms, that there's not enough meat on my bones anymore. I reached over to the fat part and my arms are like bat wings now. And, we created some how might we statements and ideated. And at the end, the one thing that these engineers kept talking about was how much they appreciated Donna and her cat shirt. And, I feel for this group of engineers as well. I was working with because they rarely get to be in the field doing that user research. And I wanted to bring a taste of that to them, right? Like, who was Donna? What was she trying to solve? What about her bat wings? Like, why did Donna care about the thing that they were working on? It really gave them a real world sense of a true user. And we got to ideate around some of the needs that came out of that research. And so I wanted to, I wanted to center a user who might not have been considered in initial designs, and a little empathy ends up going a long way when we have these spaces to be real with each other and talk about what we're going through. And I think that's actually where you'll find the truest user needs. And so ideas, whether good or bad, are needed for us to build an improv scene, right? And in our practice, we have this game called What's Next, where we improv scenes. And when the bell rings, we have to come up with something new right there on the spot and then continue the scene. And in a bar scene, I kept coming up with anything but cash to pay my tab with, like a bar of soap, or paying with a deck of cards, or paying with toothpicks. And my coach kept ringing the bell to push me to keep iterating on ideas. And so I paid my tab in true of mice and men form and pulled out a pocket mouse to pay with. And I don't think mouse pay would have been the first idea I came up with, but I'm glad I was pushed to keep ideating until that point. I mean, coach decided that that's what we were going with, and we played with that idea for the rest of the scene. It became the best idea. And in design thinking, I love the ideate phase. It's quantity versus quality. It's where you get to generate a wide range of ideas of what's possible and explore different parts of the experience or product you're designing, right? Ideating is where you get to create. And so I've gotten to lead design thinking sessions in my community work as well. And one workshop I did was around addressing criminal justice reform. And we got to the how do we fund this part? And so I had the group put their fundraising ideas onto stickies in an ideating session. And when we were reading out the ideas, I remember reading a sticky that said Beyonce. And we talked about it as a group. And I asked the person who wrote it to explain because people were initially a little confused and had that like not in a million years attitude. But the Beyonce sticky got put in the pie in the sky category of ideas and kind of left. But I found out later that the advancement team of that organization really liked the inspiration of that idea and started building out a strategy to fundraise with local celebrities. And while it might not have been Beyonce, it got a different idea going that was bringing funds into this organization. And so the ideating phase, whether in improv or design thinking, it often feels like a fun play space where we get to explore and see what ideas people are thinking about. And even when the first idea isn't the best one, it's really about creating the spaces for these ideas to come out, iterating on the idea with more ideas that can really get you to the best idea for what you're working on. And in our work, we can plan as much as we want, but there's always something that can go wrong or happen unexpectedly. We have to be flexible and willing to pivot when that doesn't happen. And of course, yes, and is really important in both improv and design thinking. That's how we get to build scenes and develop new ideas. I think that this flexibility has also come in handy in facilitating. And actually, just the other week, I was doing a workshop at a public event where about what makes us who we are. And I always try to preface in doing a workshop to challenge by choice, do what feels good for you. I never want to force anyone to do anything that they don't want to do because honestly, that's no fun. And so I began giving instructions for an activity right before folks were breaking up into small groups. And a person stood up and interrupted me. They started saying, "Who really wants to do this activity? Who else thinks that this is wrong? Anyone want to join me in not doing this activity?" And there was a moment I was like, "Am I being heckled at this event?" and and I think everyone else was a little thrown off too. But I think having done improv in the last few years, I just like tapped back into the practice of saying yes and what my scene partner says is reality, and that was okay. And so I reminded the person that if they didn't want to do the activity, that was like it's a challenge by choice. And yes, it's okay to not do the activity. The person did find someone else to talk to about not wanting to do the activity. And I loved that too, because ultimately the purpose of the small group was to find commonalities with another person. So they did the activity anyways. And so in some ways, I'm glad that that happened because it felt like another practice round and helped me in being a better facilitator and being able to handle those curveballs as they come. And in my improv practice, I've learned how to notice these like small things that are going on in a room. I've had to pick up on small cues from my scene partner or pick up on a detail, or in facilitating, handling a heckler. And so it's been a few years of my improv practice, and there are still spaces I get stuck. By no means am I perfect at this. And I want to emphasize that it is a practice because as a practitioner, I feel like there are things that I'm still learning, understanding, critiquing, evolving, and developing on what I'm working on. And oftentimes the assumption with improv is like, don't you just wing it? And in true form, like, yes, I am winging it. And it's also a practice. And I think these four things have really been at the core of my practice, that you're never too cool for anyone to play it real and lean into empathy, to ideate to the best idea and be flexible and pivot. And so not only in improv, but also design thinking, these apply as well, right? Both are really special places where we get to play and be creative in our practice of design thinking or improv. And ultimately, improv is for everyone, and there are no prerequisites. You don't have to be funny, you don't have to be witty, you don't have to be an actor, and you don't even need theater experience. Everyone gets to be creative, and it just takes some practice. And so even though I forgot my lines and never really got back to the full theater stage, I got to do the play with my sister and her elementary school best friend, and we had a ton of fun. And at the end of the day, doing that community play, I got to try it out, I got to play and be part of a fun creative process with a bunch of people. And it seems like that's something that's really stuck with me. Plus, no matter what, I still got my flowers and I continue to have fun. And so I'm always looking for other folks to share stories or geek out about improv, design thinking, or anything else. So I just want to put it out there to like feel free to reach out. I'm happy to grab in-person or virtual coffee hangs with folks and also get to know you. All right.
Thanks, Aimee. Let's go to the Q&A. We have a few in there already.
Sweet.
One is, with budget and project constraints, how do you make a case for making time for creativity within a project?
Yeah, I think that's a really real question. You know, I, there's always a business case for whatever project you're working on. I actually really loved Valerie's answer earlier about like showing the story. I think that's actually super important when thinking about creativity and trying to pull that in. Think about like what the business case is, right? Like, do you like where you are now? Do you like the thing that you're doing? Is it working? And if all of those, and all the answers to that is no, really just like look into the current practice of whatever you're working on. And there's a reason why you're looking for a new solution, right? And that takes creativity. And so I think for me, I love a good workshop. It's a space that I think where I think it like helps bring people out of their shell, right? It forces people to not eat lunch at their desk. It pulls them together in a room, and it gets people to be in community with folks. And I think that sort of like riffing and energy with one another can really spark that creativity. So for me, I always try to work in a workshop somewhere that lets that space happen.
Absolutely. Awesome. Here's another one. Can you recommend any educational resources, courses, books, etc., for someone who wants to become a design thinking practitioner and incorporate some of these practices?
Yeah, I think I will plug two things. Um, I feel like, I feel like IDEO is a really great like baseline for like design thinking things. But when you're curious even more past that, I feel like one of the things I've been evangelizing a lot lately is liberatory design, where it starts to really look at how do you build in equity into the design thinking practice. You can literally, I think it's literally like liberatorydesign.org or something. And that really gives a different perspective or yes, and right. It adds on to the perspective of like what design thinking is from an equity lens and how do we really look at ourselves as design thinking practitioners. And they provide mindsets and modes, like they call it, on how to build in equity into design thinking. But ultimately, I think it's like trying to do little like design thinking sprints. Like I think when I was very curious about it early on, I would try to do like design thinking, like the design thinking process for when I was looking at like figuring out where I want to live next, or like what do I want to do in the next like phase of my life. I would start doing these like little mini design thinking sprints within myself. And I think that's been a really helpful practice of both doing it for myself, but also finding ways to build it into my work. Because I think it's both the actual practice of doing design thinking, but also the mindsets that come with it.
Yeah, awesome. So we have another one. Do you have suggestions for short improv games or rituals to start collaborative meetings?
Mm. I think for me, um, one of my favorite ones is like sometimes we like get in our heads a little bit of like trying to find the perfect thing. And one of my favorite like design thinking slash like improv games are like, what is the worst idea? Because sometimes it's like, oh, we're trying to get to the best idea, right? But sometimes we have to go through that process. And so in the same ideating space, sometimes I'll be like, well, think of the worst idea for the question that we're doing. And so it's starting to think about like, oh yeah, that would be terrible. Or like, oh my God, that would be awful. And so sometimes I would do like a mini ideation before the actual ideation to get folks kind of out of their things and like get their juices flowing. And then you can kind of start getting there. One of the thing I remember reading an article once of like people often are not to their fullest like ideating and creativity because they're nervous and anxious about sharing their ideas. And so I think when you try to get all of the bad ideas out, it kind of just sets the tone of like, oh, that was fun, or like, oh, we get to ideate a little bit more. And I think that's been a really fun space, an activity that I've facilitated a couple times.
Good idea. All right, this will be the last one. What is the one thing that they could do to build a creative improv practice into their day-to-day?
I think with that question, day to day is really important. Um, and for me, one of the things that I was doing at the top that my coach was telling me to do at the top of every class is we would literally spend like 10 minutes wandering the room. And we're like, oh my God, at first I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? Like, why are we doing this? Like, I don't want to walk around the room. But he started saying, like, just spend time looking around. Like, what do you notice? Notice the space, the cracks, the things that you don't usually see. And so we'd start every single class like that. And that's been something in my day to day that I've brought with me from my practice is like, I will just like spend a little bit of time every day just walking around my home or like going for walks in the same route, but like finding some of the things that I didn't notice before, because that really builds your like noticing muscle, to really just like see what's going on in the world. And I think that's actually been really helpful.
A good idea for all of us. Well, with that, thank you so much, Aimee.